After centuries of semi-isolation, Japan was quick to make up for lost time. The arrival of American Commodore Matthew Perry's 4 black ships shook them to their core. These steamships, equipped with modern cannons and shells, electrified Japan, and after years of struggling with more traditional elements of Japanese society, they began a process of rapid industrialization. They were determined to avoid the fates of India and China. In Western powers like Germany, France, Great Britain, and the United States, Japan had the blueprints for industrialization. Japanese leaders began to vigorously study Western political systems and adopted European technology. They sent missions abroad to learn their ways and brought in experts from Europe and America to teach them. The Japanese supported strong state intervention in the economy. Their slogan was Fukoku Kyohei, rich country, strong military. The process was greatly helped by Japan's already high literacy rate, and the wealth generated by industrialization was used to strengthen their military. The Japanese didn't just copy Western political systems, they began to act aggressively in the region. First, they crushed China, the regional hegemon, between 1894 and 1895. A decade later, they went to war with Russia, and after a series of hard-fought battles, they managed to get a crushing victory over the Russian fleet in the Battle of Tsushima Strait. In 1910, they annexed Korea. Japan sided with the Entente in the Great War, but its distance from the main battlefields in Europe allowed them to avoid heavy fighting. Their largest engagement during the war was in the Siege of Qingdao, where Japanese soldiers and their British allies overwhelmed a heavily outnumbered and outgunned German garrison. Aside from that, Japan was able to reap the benefits of peace. Japanese industrial goods were able to take the place of their European counterparts on the international market. During the war, the Japanese economy grew by 40%, and for the first time, Japan generated a trade surplus. Many Japanese patriots felt like they had finally made it. They had achieved great military victories, expanded their empire, and enriched their country. However, the Treaty of Versailles left them feeling unsatisfied. Of particular note, the Japanese had proposed adding a racial equality clause to the treaty's preamble. This was supported by the French and the Italians, but was rejected by the British and the Americans. Add this to the Washington Naval Conference that set a ratio of 5-5-3 of capital ships for the United States, United Kingdoms, and Japan respectively. They began to drift away from the Western liberal democracies. The Japanese launched an invasion of Manchuria in 1931. The Chinese were defeated, and Manchukuo was established as a puppet state. In 1937, Japan invaded China again. In addition to these Sino-Japanese conflicts, Japan fought a series of border clashes with the Soviet Union. The battles of Khalkhin Gol are believed by many to have caused Tokyo to rethink going to war with the Soviet Union. These battles resulted in a decisive defeat. However, if we look at the details, the Japanese actually performed very well tactically. The Japanese were outnumbered 2-1. The Soviets had 5 times as many tanks and of higher quality. They had twice as many airplanes, artillery pieces, and trucks. Even still, the Soviets suffered heavier casualties than the Japanese and lost significant amounts of equipment. Man for man, the Japanese did well. They failed operationally. The Soviets were able to operate 700 kilometers away from the nearest railhead for 2 months. Their mechanized corps advanced 100 kilometers in a day. The Japanese were smashed one after another. The Soviets moved freely, while they remained contained. Even though the Japanese had lost at Khalkhin Gol, they developed 2 competing doctrines for expansion, Nanshin-ron and Hokushin-ron, the Southern Expansion Doctrine and the Northern Expansion Doctrine. The Imperial Japanese Navy advocated for expansion into Southeast Asia, to secure natural resources from Western colonies, eliminate Chinese supply routes, and to neutralize the Allied military presence in the region. The Imperial Japanese Army believed they should strike north for territory in Siberia and destroy the communist regime. In 1941, their German allies invaded the Soviet Union with the goal of destroying Russia and settling the land with Germans. They hoped that Japan would join them, but instead, they held true to their non-aggression pact. But what if Japan had joined Germany in the war against the Soviet Union. Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe was mortified by the German invasion of the Soviet Union. He considered it a betrayal and even considered leaving the Axis over it, but Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka believed that they should attack, and his views were supported by the Chief of the Operations Bureau, Major General Shinichi Tanaka, and the Kwantung Army, the occupation force in Manchuria. The Army General Staff believed that whatever else, it was important for the fighting to end by mid-October, because the harsh climate of Siberia would disrupt military activities in the winter. The Army would need 60 to 70 days to complete operational planning, and 6 to 8 weeks to defeat the Soviet Union in the first phase of the offensive. The Army General Staff came up with a crash schedule for planning to shave off as much time as possible. In their plans, they would begin concentrating divisions in August, and launch their offensive in September, even though this gave them a very small window for the operation. The Army General Staff called for 22 divisions with 850,000 men, including auxiliary units, supported with 800 tons of shipping. They hoped that the Soviets would have reduced their infantry by half, and their armored and air forces by 2/3, giving the Kwantung Army a 2-to-1 superiority. General Tanaka would later increase the number of divisions to 25 with the support of Emperor Hirohito and General Hideki Tojo. This plan was called Kantokuen, the Kwantung Army Special Maneuvers. They banked on the Soviets being unable to reinforce the Far East. In any case, this would be the single greatest mobilization in the history of the Japanese Army. Air power would play a crucial role in the plan. They planned to contribute 2,000 to 3,000 planes to the Kwantung Army that would try to deliver a sudden, annihilating attack on the Soviet Air Force at the start of hostilities, before switching to provide tactical support to troops on the ground. The Japanese estimated that due to the limited capacity of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, the Soviets would only be able to bring 55 to 60 divisions to bear on the Japanese. Soviet plans were largely defensive. They had 2 fronts under the command of Generals Joseph Apanesenko and Mikhail Kovalyov. They initially had about 650,000 men, but that number was increased to over 1.3 million by August, even though troops had been diverted to the European theater. So even in their most desperate hours, the Soviets would still be able to concentrate far greater military power than the Japanese had hoped. The Soviets also had nearly 170,000 sailors in the Far East, but the Red Navy was no match for its Japanese counterpart. In any case, the war would be decided on land. Japan would likely win initial engagements with Stalin's army and push into their territory. However, the Soviets would retreat further west, and the Japanese were far less motorized than the Germans, who weren't very motorized in the first place. The Japanese advance would be slow, and they'd be dependent on Siberia's poor infrastructure to support their operations. The Soviet Air Force planned to destroy their Japanese counterpart, preferably on the ground, but seeing as their plans were defensive, and the Japanese had a habit of attacking by surprise without a formal declaration of war, that was unlikely to happen. Japan's greatest weakness was its weak industry. The Japanese would have to gamble 2/3 of their ammunition stockpile on the opening blow. Perhaps the greatest benefit of Japanese intervention in the German-Soviet War is that it would cut off another avenue for Lend-Lease to get into the Soviet Union. That means Britain and America would be much more dependent on the Arctic route and the Iranian route to supply Stalin's forces. Although the Japanese had gained years of fighting experience against the Chinese, that didn't necessarily translate to a campaign against the Soviets. They had a much firmer understanding of concepts such as massed firepower and motor-based logistics. For the Imperial Japanese Army, 100 kilometers was far, and 200 trucks was many. To counter their material resources, the Japanese would rely on intangible factors like fighting spirit and elan. The defensive phase of the war for the Soviet Union lasted between 1941 and 1943 in our timeline. With them being pressed on both sides, it would last until 1944 here. American entry into World War II would be delayed, but it was inevitable. However, Without the forces necessary for the Strike South plan, the Pacific War would be greatly shortened, with the Japanese Navy being destroyed by 1944, and America avoiding the costly and lengthy island-hopping process. The German war effort would go better, but it's unlikely to change the final outcome, Soviet victory. Perhaps Leningrad would fall, but the Soviet Union still wins. Britain, America, and Canada would still wait until 1944 to liberate France because they were not prepared in 1943. With Germany pressed on both sides, the surrender would come in 1945. Only the Western Allies would take Berlin, and Poland would be divided between the East and the West. Thank you for watching my video. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and have a nice day.